We're on day 2 of the New York Giants top 5 ahead of training camp. What's on today's list? I'm going to tell you next, coming up on today's LockedOn Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Family, your team every day. I'm Patricia Traina. Happy Tuesday to everybody. That's right. We are breaking from the summer schedule in which I do a show Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, because all this week I'm talking about top 5 lists. I've put together 5 top 5 lists covering various topics. So we're going to continue that on today's show. Thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day, or if watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. So what's on tap for today's show? Well, we're going to do the top 5 X factors ahead of Giants 2022 training camp. And I'm also going to circle back to yesterday's topic, which were the top 5 Giants, most important Giants ahead of training camp. Some of you chimed in on the list that I presented on Monday's show, and you gave me your own list. So we'll mention those real quick as well on today's show. Again, happy to have you with us. And again, thank you for making us your first listen of the day. All right. We've got 5 things, 5 X factors for the New York Giants that I've designated, at least for the New York Giants. These are things that ideally they go in the Giants' way. And if they don't, well, let's just say the season could get very interesting if these 5 things don't come to fruition. So, as I did with yesterday's show, if you want to contribute, if you have a different list, by all means, submit it. I'm always curious to see what you guys and gals think. And, that's what you did for yesterday's list of the top 5 Giants ahead of training camp. So I'm going to go down on my list. And then I also have some honorable mentions that didn't quite make this list, but should have made this list probably if I'd done more than 5. So let's talk about it. Let's get right into it. All right. The 5th most important thing, again, we're counting backwards 5 to number 1 of the top 5 X factors that the New York Giants need to have happen in order to have, the type of season I think we think they can have. All right, number 5 on my list, the gelling process. Now, what do I mean by that? You've got all new systems, offense and defense. All right. The players learned all that stuff in the spring. They did a lot of installs, and there was a lot of work done to kind of get up and running to where the idea is when they hit training camp, when they get to the padded part of training camp practice, they can hit the ground running. They don't have to sit there and do a lot of thinking and a lot of, hesitating. But there's another element to this gelling process that I think is going to be overlooked, but is important. And we kind of saw this last year, actually, with some of the new players. And that is this past spring, the Giants had a lot of players that were wearing red medical jerseys. They were not able to fully participate in all the drills. So when you have players that are missing in action, well, guess what? That's going to maybe delay the start of the gelling process. And I'm specifically thinking in terms of the receivers. All right. So with the receivers, Kenny Golladay, Sterling Shepard, Kadarius Toney, all had medical issues that kept them out of the majority of the practices. All right. They were working on the side with trainers or doing individuals in some cases. Not having those guys catch passes from Daniel Jones in this new offense with some of these new schemes and whatnot. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, the receiver just has to get open and catch the ball. But there's different cadences, there's different timing, there's a lot of different things when you install a new offense. And it's like, just coming together and learning it all over again. It's like, yeah, you ride a bike. You never forget how to learn. You never forget how to ride a bike, but you got to get used to it again if you haven't done it for a number of years or for a long time. So kind of the same thing. And we saw that last summer, if you remember correctly, Kenny Galladay, when he first came in from after signing as a free agent, he did a lot of extra work in the spring with Daniel Jones. And then when they got to the summer, Galladay suffered that hamstring strain. And the timing and the chemistry that they had built up in the spring basically went down the tubes. So how quickly are those guys going to be cleared to come back? And how quickly can they gel? That to me is a big, big X factor. And not just, at the receiver spot. I'm talking across the board, wherever there were guys missing due to medical issues. That gelling process, the faster that team gels, the faster they're going to be able to hit the ground running and the faster they're going to be able to play. And that's going to be very, very important for the Giants as they get ready to hopefully hit the ground running when they start the regular season. So that is number 5 on my list of top 5 X factors. All right. The next thing on my list, item number 4, is the rookie contribution. And I'm talking specifically about the draft class, the class of 2022. The Giants had 11 picks. All right. Now, will all 11 make the roster? Probably not. Will the majority of them make the roster? I would say yes. Now, what can we expect from the 11, or what should we expect from the 11? Well, it's interesting because this particular draft class of the Giants is kind of a mix. And by that, I mean, there are guys on here that you expect to hit the ground running as a day one. And then there are guys on this list that are going to probably be rotational type players. And then there are still guys that I think will probably be practice squatters. So you have a little bit of everything, I think, in this draft class. Now, who do we expect to hit the ground running? Obviously, the 2 first-round picks, Kayvon Thibodeau and Evan Neal. I think they're going to be, starters if they are healthy. I think Wan'Dale Robinson is going to hit the ground running day one, be a big part of that offense. I think Daniel Bellinger, the first of the 4th-round picks, he's going to be a big role player for the Giants. Now, some of the guys that I think could maybe be practice squatters. Well, actually, let me talk about the guys who I think might be more substitutions or rotational type guys. I could see maybe Micah McFadden or Darian Beavers. I think one of the two of them is going to end up, being part of the rotation, whereas the other one is probably going to land on special teams. I think Cordell Flott is going to be part of some of the sub packages. Joshua Ezeudu, I think at this point, even though he worked with the starters in the spring, I could see him potentially being on the practice squad, right? That, though, is going to depend on how the veterans in front of him do. So, the Giants signed a lot of veterans as part of their offensive line rebuild, and there's a reason for that, which I will get to actually a little later on in the program. So spoiler alert there. But I think, he and maybe Marcus McKeithen, I don't see both of them making the 53-man roster. I think maybe one of them goes to the practice squad. Maybe the other one goes to the reserve list. When I say the reserve list, the backup becomes a backup on the 53-man roster. And let me just see, Dane Belton, I can see having a role. DJ Davidson, I think might be practice squad, given what's in front of him. But again, this is all subject to change because we haven't seen these guys in pads. We also need to kind of, see these guys at full speed. And, we need to see live contact. So it's kind of premature to really say for sure what guys are going to, what to predict this stuff. But these are just some very, very early preliminary predictions on my part. But the point being is this is a very deep rookie class for the Giants, and their contributions are going to be key. I think what we want to see from them as we go along is, even if all 11 aren't on the 53-man roster or contributing, on a frequent basis, in the beginning. We want to see that change as the season goes on, because ultimately a lot of these veterans who were signed ahead of these guys to 1-year deals, chances are they won't be back next year. So you want to see some of these younger players really start to develop and be able to take over for some of these veterans that might be day one starters for this team. So that's what I mean when I say the rookie contribution. All right. We have 3 more coming up on the list. I will tell you what number 3 and number 2 are right after this. All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's LockedOn Giants podcast. But first, BetOnline.net is the only place that offers the best information on the latest odds, contests, and player props for all your sports betting needs. No matter what sport you're into, BetOnline.net has you covered. Plus, they offer everything you need to know for live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. So head on over to betonline.net today to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the LockedOn Giants podcast. I am Patricia Traina, and we are talking about the top 5 X factors for the New York Giants ahead of training camp. And before I get into items number 3 and 2 on my list, I want to give a shout out to Michael Bryant, who responded on YouTube when I invited you guys to submit your lists. If you disagreed with my list, I invited you to submit your list. And Michael Bryant actually submitted his list of the top 5 Giants ahead of training camp. And his lists from number 5 down to number 1 included Julian Love at number 5, Saquon Barkley at number 4, Daniel Jones at number 3, Adoree Jackson at number 2, and Leonard Williams at number 1. And I believe he had, let's see, I know Barkley was on my list, Jackson was on my list, Jones was on my list. I think those 3 we agreed on, maybe not in the same order, but certainly, we're thinking the same thing. So thank you, Michael, for submitting your list. And again, folks, if you want to comment on the lists that I am putting up, if you have your own ideas, submit them, and I'll mention them here on the show as I do the new shows this week. All right. So our current list, ladies and gentlemen, is X Factors, top 5 X Factors ahead of the 2022 Giants training camp. So we've got 2 so far in the books, being the gelling process and the rookie contribution. All right, number 3 on my list. And this had to be on the list because, to leave it off, in my opinion, would just not be very smart. The offensive line. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, that's obvious. The Giants need their offensive line to perform. They need that unit to step up and be solid. Now, I have said this before about the offensive line, and I think it bears repeating. The Giants have taken a totally opposite approach to building the offensive line this year than they did last year. And I like this approach actually a little bit better than I did the one last year, because I think it's going to yield fewer questions down the line while also setting the Giants up better for the future. So let's just recap real quick. Last year, the Giants were set to roll the dice on the young players. They had mostly young players. All right. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when you're talking about an offense that's trying to find its footing, probably want to have some veterans mixed in there. And, the plan was to give a lot of those guys, they move guys around. They put, guys that maybe hadn't played certain positions before. There was too much uncertainty. There was too much room for error. And yes, injuries played a factor in it, but it's just this whole approach that the Giants took last year of, let's play the young guys and we'll use the veterans as backups in case the young guys falter. Nah, if anything, it should have been reversed, in my opinion. And in fact, that's what the Giants did this year. I always refer to it as the corporate training approach. Okay. So you open up a new restaurant and corporate sends down trainers to work with the local staff to get them up to speed. And then the the trainers go away and then it's okay, young staff, it's now in your hands to, make the most out of this business. That's the approach the Giants are taking this year. And I like it. And I'll tell you why. So they have some youth on the offensive line. So Andrew Thomas is entering his third year. Evan Neal on the other offensive tackle spot is a rookie. Okay, fine. Now in the interior, which is where they've had some issues, most of their issues actually, they are projected to have all veterans, right? So you got John Feliciano, who knows the Buffalo offense pretty much inside and out. He's going to be the center. Mark Lewinsky, who has been a solid player for the Indianapolis Colts, he's going to be your right guard. So he's going to be next to Evan Neal to kind of help him along as they, develop Evan Neal as a player. Then at left guard, Shea Lemieux projects to be the starter at left guard, but of course there's going to be a competition there. You're going to have Max Garcia, you're going to have Jameel Douglas competing for that spot. So it's just a better setup because you've got corporate trainers coming in to show these young guys, hey, this is how it's done. And then meanwhile, you've got a bunch of young depth behind them, guys that need to be developed still, so that when all these veterans who are on one-year contracts aren't re-signed, and they're not all going to be re-signed next year, the Giants are going to probably turn to the younger guys. So the hope is let's get these younger guys ready. Then when we can move on from these older guys, and now we can replace them with younger and less expensive talent, which will help the salary cap. So that's the approach the Giants are taking with the offensive line. It's a bit of a risk, but it's probably less of a risk than what the Giants did last year. And that's why I like it. That's why, if everybody stays healthy, I think this plan has a better chance of succeeding than just, saying, okay, you know what? The kids got to play, which they do. You can, at some point you do have to turn the kids loose, but I think you have to do it in gradual steps, especially when you have still a relatively young quarterback behind them and a guy who hasn't quite found his footing as an NFL quarterback. So, if you had Eli Manning, for example, behind the offensive line last year, maybe Eli could have made a better go of it. I don't know. Probably not, given how much pressure was allowed. But that had to be taken into consideration too. So I like the Giants' approach, and I think how that offensive line comes together is going to be a big X factor for the Giants. Also, not just for the long-term future of the team, but for the offense and for Daniel Jones, because Daniel Jones, the Giants got to find out what they have in him, and they cannot find out what they have in him if he's constantly going to be running for his life or on his back. So I agree with that approach for the offensive line. Okay, item number 2 on my list of top 5 X factors for the New York Giants ahead of training camp is how will they handle adversity? All right, now we're getting into a category that I don't think a lot of people really think about. And I think it's an important one. What do I mean by adversity? Well, actually, let's kind of rewind the tape a little bit this year since Brian Daboll was hired. Right now, Brian Daboll, Joe Shane, they're in the honeymoon stage. Everything has been going swimmingly well. There hasn't been any adversity. We haven't had any controversies. We haven't had any contract holdouts. We haven't had any, guys go down with serious season-ending injuries. We haven't had any of that. This has been a calm spring for the New York Giants. Okay, it's actually been a fun one. You listen to the players, they talk about being energized. You hear them talk about their excitement with the schemes and how the schemes are going to put them in the best position to be successful and so on and so forth. There's been zero adversity that has hit this team because this team hasn't played a game yet. So that being said, guess what? Not every day is going to be a picnic. So how will this team react the minute adversity strikes? Now, again, adversity can come in any number of forms. It could be a season-ending injury to a key player. It could be a bad loss. It could be a losing streak, right? It could be anything. How will this coaching staff handle it? That's key. All right. So let's take, for example, the Giants get off to a slow start and they have a losing streak and they really don't look good. How is Brian Dable going to handle this? You go back and you look at how Joe Judge tried to handle it. Joe Judge never really experienced adversity in his career. I know he spoke about having feared for his job at one point when he was with the Patriots, but they had a winning record, if I'm not mistaken. They might have hit a little tiny rough patch, which was nothing compared to what the Giants were going through under Judge. Dable, even though he comes from that, Saban Belichick tree, he's had some experience, I think, with adversity. Now, not as a head coach, but he's been around, coaches that have had to deal with it, has taken some of those lessons. And, how's he going to react? I think he's going to react fine. I think he's just going to say, okay, look, these are the cards that have been dealt to us. This is what we need to do to pull out of it. We need to pull out of it together. It's not going to be a situation where Dable shuts off everybody and says, okay, I'm going to get us out of it. It's a group effort. Win as a team, lose as a team, fight as a team. All right. And I think sometimes in the past, that wasn't always the case with the Giants. So the thing that I like about Dable, and the reason why I think he's going to be really equipped to lead the team out of any adverse situations, is because he is promoting right now during the harmonious times, he's promoting ownership to everyone. All right. So it's not my program. It's the New York Giants program. Daniel Jones, it's your program. Leonard Williams, it's your program. Saquon Barkley, it's your program. So everybody has a piece of ownership, if you will, an ownership stake. Some guys more than others. And that includes, the reserves. That includes every guy on the training camp roster. And it's what they make of it when adversity strikes. All right. So let's say, for example, let's say Kenny Golladay isn't ready to go, which I think he will be, by the way. I'm just using it as an example. So Kenny Galladay's not ready to go. All right. Who's behind him? Colin Johnson. What receivers behind him ready to step up and mitigate the adversity that is being caused by Kenny Galladay's absence? That's what I'm talking about there. All right. And I think if they keep their feet on the ground and don't panic, potentially, I think the Giants will be able to withstand just about any kind of adversity that comes with the normal course of playing a football game. That includes a season-ending injury. That includes getting beat. That includes a losing streak. All right. I don't think we will see a situation where, a coach gets desperate. All right. I don't think we will see Brian Dable go on an 11-minute, rant to justify and insist that improvement is being made behind the scenes. I think we will see even-keeled and just a calm, focused and collective approach to pulling the team out of whatever adversity strikes. But that being said, we need to see it. And that's why I think that's an X factor that needs to be considered and on this list. All right, coming up next, ladies and gentlemen, I have my honorable mentions, and then I have the number one item, the number one X factor ahead of the Giants 2022 training camp. So stick around. We'll be right back with more. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the LockedOn Giants podcast. I'm Patricia Traina, and we are doing top 5 lists all this week on the LockedOn Giants podcast, which means we're doing 5 days worth of shows. All right. Normally we're in our summer schedule now doing shows on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but I had these 5 lists and I said, you know what? I'm just going to do a whole week's worth of shows. Why not? Something to carry us over as we get closer to training camp, which is about, I want to say 4 weeks away, maybe give or take. So it's coming up soon, and I'm excited to continue to bring you content on the Locked On Giants podcast. So thanks again for tuning in. We are doing the top 5 X factors ahead of the 2022 Giants training camp. We've done 4 already. Now, before I get to number 1, I am going to give you some honorable mentions. Now, I tried coming up with 5 for the honorable mentions. I couldn't quite come up with 5, but the ones I came up with, I think are pretty relevant. So let's get them started here in no particular order. Daniel Jones's progress. That goes without saying. I mean, do I really need to explain why that's an X factor and what that potentially means? And if I do need to explain it, may I refer you back to yesterday's show when I talked about the top 5 most important Giants, in my opinion, and what Daniel Jones's development or lack thereof would mean for this franchise. All right. Another thing I talked about, Saquon Barkley's return. Can Saquon be Saquon? He's going to have a big role in this offense, folks. So if Saquon isn't healthy, if he isn't explosive, if he's had any kind of drop off physically, that's going to be a problem for the Giants moving forward. So far, I think so good. I didn't see anything that would lead me to believe that we should be concerned about Saquon Barkley. But again, we've got to see them with pads on, and we've got to see them playing at a faster speed than what we did in the spring. And then here's another one. This one I haven't mentioned, but I think this one's important too. And that is the opponents on the Giants schedule. Now, we talk about how sometimes the Giants can catch a break when they face the opponents, right? And by that, I mean, let's say, let's take the Dallas Cowboys, for example. And let's say the Giants happen to catch the Cowboys on a week where they might not have Micah Parsons or Dak Prescott or Ezekiel Elliott or some other key player. That's an X factor as well. A lot of people, when they say, oh, can you predict the record, or do you want to predict the record of the Giants? And I'm reluctant to do that because you just don't know how the opponent's roster is going to shape up. And sometimes, a key injury or something happens and it just changes the complexion of what the opponent is going to look like. And therefore, it can change your outlook for that particular game. So I think that is a big X factor. How are these other rosters going to take shape? And more importantly, who's going to be available by the time they come up on the Giants schedule? So those are the 3 that I came up with as honorable mentions. All right. My number 1 item on the top 5 X factors is injuries. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, injuries. You didn't think I was going to leave that one out, right? I mean, come on. That's been a problem with this team for what? The last decade, most of the last decade. All right. So here's the thing. The Giants have been one of, if not the most injured NFL teams, right, over the last several years. And some people will blame the turf. Some people will say, well, it's just a game. The game is violent and, stuff is going to happen. What is the factor and what can the Giants do to mitigate it? And, listen, this is a mystery that every head coach since Tom Coughlin, and maybe even before Tom Coughlin, has tried to solve. All right. Some coaches have gone soft during training camp. Some believe that the extra conditioning will help during training camp. Some believe in lightening the load. In other words, giving players more rest and therefore making the schedule irregular. Some believe that you go and you lift after, a practice. I mean, there's been all kinds of different theories tried out by different coaching staffs, and none have really worked. So what is Brian Daboll trying to do? What is his approach? And will it work? Well, first off, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Daboll comes from a Buffalo team that was among the least injured in the NFL. They didn't really have injury issues. So what lessons might Brian Dable bring down from Buffalo besides, obviously having, a good strength and conditioning and medical and sports science staff? Well, Dable was actually asked about that in the spring, and something he said really caught my attention, because I think the last coaching staff was kind of guilty of not doing this. And that's something is you've got to strike a balance in your practices. All right. Football practices, especially during training camp, when it's hot as heck outside, they take a lot out of you. All right. I go to these practices and it's a hot, muggy day. And I got to tell you, when I come home and I'm just kind of standing there or maybe just walking around, I'm not doing half the exercises these guys are doing. When I come home, I'm exhausted from the heat. My energy has been sapped. All right. So if I try and work out, if I try to do anything, that exerts a lot of energy, guess what? I end up hurting myself. All right. And I know, because I've done this in the past where I've come home and I've said, oh, I didn't get enough steps in, or I didn't do my weights. I've got to do this. And I've gone on and I've hurt myself. So Dable's approach has kind of been, look, we're going to have intense practices, but these guys are going to get their conditioning by running around and doing all the things that they need to do from a football perspective. So that being said, maybe they'll do extra conditioning after practice. It really depends on, the data that the coaches and the sports science people collect. It depends on the coaching staff's observations of the players. Were they sluggish? Were their tongues hanging out as the practice wore on? It's going to be determined on a case-by-case basis. It's not automatically written into the practice, right? So you're going to see a mixture of it. And that's probably the best way to go, because you don't want to have these guys, at the end of an intense practice on a really, really hot day. You don't want to overwork them. That was part of the problem last year. There were players and whispers that maybe the coaching staff went a little too hard on them as far as, the conditioning aspect of it. All right. Another thing that Brian Dable has kind of brought back that we hadn't seen since the days of Tom Coughlin, post-practice stretching. The best time to stretch after a workout is after you let your heart rate cool down, and you stretch. You let everything come back down to normal. Your muscles are warmed up. You stretch them out so that this way they just don't automatically snap back to their pre-workout format. Okay, so it's kind of like a rubber band. You're stretching out your muscles and your ligaments, and then after you're done, exerting it, you're very slowly letting it come back to normal, as opposed to putting it back to normal and then going in and trying to lift weights or, run or whatever. And now you have to start all over again. So that sequence, I think, is going to be important as well. The Giants been doing post-practice stretching, something, again, we haven't really seen since Tom Coughlin and the days of bands. Boy, I miss those days. We don't quite have bands, but we do have post-practice stretching. Okay, so these are all elements that hopefully will help the Giants with mitigate some of the injuries. Now, there's one other thing I want to mention that this coaching staff is kind of doing a little bit differently than what we've seen in the past, and that is guys who have medical issues. And we saw this a lot in the spring. If they were in a red jersey, some of those guys worked off to the side with trainers, obviously, but those who even had medical issues and were able to do partly some of their workload were out there participating. And I'm talking even in team drills. Like, for example, Aaron Robinson had a red jersey on. Well, he was doing limited work as opposed to just kind of being kept off to the side and not doing anything. And that's important, folks, because it's kind of like if you go to the gym religiously 5 days a week or whatever, and you do your workouts, your legs, your upper body and all that stuff. And then you stop because you have an injury, and then you don't go to the gym for like 2-3 weeks. what happens is you kind of lose a little bit of what you built up. So I think what the Giants are trying to do is they're trying to keep these guys so that they can continue doing what they need to do within reason, obviously, because they don't want to aggravate the injuries so that, while they're rehabbing, whatever it is they're rehabbing, they don't have to go back and start from scratch. And now all of a sudden, oh my God, I've got to go from 0 to 100, which can cause the guy to maybe press a little harder and pull injuries. So that's kind of an approach I like that this coaching staff is doing, and this medical staff apparently has signed off on. Now, will it pay off? We'll have to see. As I've said, the Giants, for whatever reason, have been one of the most injured teams in the NFL, but we'll see if some of these changes, these little tweaks, make a difference for the Giants moving forward. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for us here on the LockedOn Giants podcast. Again, if you have a different list, you want to contribute to the list, go ahead, send me a comment. If watching on YouTube, if you're listening on our audio platforms, drop me an email. Be curious to see what you have to say. Otherwise, as always, thank you for making us your first listen of the day, or watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. We'll be back again tomorrow with an all-new LockedOn Giants podcast. Until then, everybody, have a great one, and we'll talk to you soon.